get why you stopped me. I wasn't speeding, and you know it.
Ma'am, your rear plate didn't read in the system. I'm just making sure everything
Then
checks
check it
out.
and let me go. I got a long drive ahead of me.
I understand you're in a hurry. I just need your license and
It's in
registration.
my purse in the back. I'm not reaching for it.
At 8:32 on a clear Saturday morning along Jefferson Parkway in Brookdale County, a pearl-white Lamborghini Huracan rolled smoothly through a green light and merged into the light weekend traffic. The car moved with quiet precision, its engine humming softly as it stayed perfectly within the posted speed limit. Inside the driver's seat sat a woman in her early 50s, calm and composed, one hand resting lightly on the wheel as sunlight reflected across the polished hood of the car. 6 car lengths behind her, Officer Daniel Mercer of the Brookdale Police Department watched from inside his patrol cruiser. Mercer was 41 years old, a 15-year veteran of the force, and his dash camera had been recording since the start of his shift. The small red indicator on his body camera blinked steadily against his uniform as he followed the Lamborghini through one intersection, then another, then another. He didn't activate his lights. He didn't run the plates. For nearly 4 blocks, he simply stayed behind the vehicle, watching carefully, waiting for a reason to justify a stop that, so far, didn't exist. The driver obeyed every traffic rule, signaled before changing lanes, and maintained a steady speed. There was nothing suspicious about the car, nothing illegal about the way it was being driven. Yet Mercer's eyes stayed fixed on it, his expression tightening as the luxury sports car moved ahead of him through the quiet morning streets. Finally, at the next intersection, he reached forward and flipped on the cruiser's emergency lights. The red and blue flashes lit up the rear of the Lamborghini instantly. The driver responded immediately, signaling and guiding the vehicle calmly toward the curb without hesitation. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary traffic stop, something that happened thousands of times every day across the country. But the cameras already recording from Mercer's cruiser were about to capture a moment that would soon destroy his entire career. The driver of the Lamborghini was Dr. Vanessa Carter. She was 53 years old, a constitutional law professor at Georgetown University and one of the most respected legal scholars in the country when it came to civil rights and police accountability. Before entering academia, she had spent more than a decade inside the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, investigating unlawful police conduct and helping prosecute cases involving illegal searches, excessive force, and systemic discrimination inside law enforcement agencies. Her work had contributed to federal oversight investigations in multiple states, and her published research was frequently cited in major constitutional law cases. None of that history, however, was visible from the driver's seat of the Lamborghini that morning. What Officer Daniel Mercer saw when he stepped out of his cruiser was simply a black woman behind the wheel of a car that cost more than most houses in the neighborhoods he usually patrolled. Mercer walked toward the driver's side slowly, one hand resting near his belt as his body camera recorded every step. He didn't greet her, and he didn't introduce himself. Instead, when the window lowered halfway, his first words came out blunt and suspicious. "Whose car is this?" The question hung in the air for a moment. "Doctor." Carter looked up at him calmly over the rim of her sunglasses, her posture relaxed and her voice steady when she answered, "It's mine." Mercer studied her face, then glanced at the interior of the Lamborghini as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the assumption already forming in his mind. "You got proof of that?" he asked. Without arguing, Dr. Carter moved slowly and deliberately toward the center console, making sure every movement was visible. "My license and registration are right here," she said quietly as she handed the documents over. Mercer took them and began examining them far longer than necessary, flipping the registration back and forth and holding the driver's license up, as though comparing the photograph to a person he had already decided didn't belong behind the wheel of a car like this. Officer Mercer stood there for several seconds, studying the documents as if they might suddenly reveal something suspicious. The registration clearly listed the vehicle as belonging to Vanessa Carter. The driver's license was valid, the address matched, and there were no restrictions or alerts attached to her record. Still, Mercer kept flipping the registration back and forth between his fingers, his eyes moving slowly from the paperwork to the woman standing calmly inside the car. Finally, he spoke again, his tone carrying the same doubt that had been there from the beginning. "You don't look like the type that usually owns a car like this," he said casually. The comment hung in the air between them. Dr. Carter said nothing. Mercer gave a short shrug, as if the remark had been perfectly reasonable, and walked back to his patrol cruiser. Inside the car, he ran the plates through the system. The computer confirmed exactly what the paperwork already showed. The Lamborghini Huracan was registered legally to Vanessa Carter. No outstanding warrants, no flags, no stolen vehicle report. Everything about the stop should have ended right there. Instead, Mercer sat in the driver's seat, staring at the screen for nearly a full minute, his jaw tightening as the information failed to support the suspicion he had already convinced himself must be true. Eventually, he stepped out of the cruiser again and walked back toward the Lamborghini. This time, his voice had changed. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," he said. Dr. Carter looked at him steadily. "For what reason, officer?" Mercer leaned slightly closer to the window. "I'm detecting the odor of marijuana coming from inside the car." The claim was completely fabricated. There had never been marijuana inside the vehicle, and later forensic testing would confirm there were no traces of any controlled substances anywhere in the car. But Mercer understood that the claim alone could legally justify a search. Dr. Carter opened the door slowly and stepped out, keeping her hands visible at her sides. Before moving away from the vehicle, she spoke clearly enough for the officer's body camera to capture every word. "I am complying with your order," she said calmly, "but I do not consent to any search of my person or my vehicle." Mercer didn't acknowledge the statement. Instead, he motioned toward the rear of the Lamborghini, and within minutes the routine traffic stop began turning into something far more serious. Mercer directed Dr. Carter toward the rear of the Lamborghini and positioned her beside the passenger side door, the glossy white paint reflecting the flashing red and blue lights from his cruiser. "Stand right here," he said flatly. She complied without argument, placing her hands calmly at her sides while the officer turned back toward the vehicle. By then, a second patrol unit had arrived, pulling up behind Mercer's cruiser. Officer Tyler Grant stepped out and approached, glancing briefly at the Lamborghini before looking toward Mercer for direction. Mercer jerked his head toward the open driver's door. "Start checking it," he said. Grant hesitated for a moment, but then moved forward. The search began immediately. The glove compartment was opened and its contents removed one by one. The center console followed, then the door compartments. Mercer lifted a leather handbag from the passenger seat and placed it on the hood of the Lamborghini before emptying it out piece by piece. A wallet slid across the smooth metal surface, followed by a pair of reading glasses, a small notebook, a tube of hand cream, and several folded receipts. Each item was inspected briefly before being left scattered across the hood. Nothing illegal appeared. Mercer moved to the rear storage compartment next, lifting the hatch and pulling out a small gym bag. Inside were nothing more than a pair of running shoes, a towel, and a water bottle. Meanwhile, Dr. Carter remained standing quietly where Mercer had positioned her, her expression steady as she watched the search unfold. Across the street, the front door of a nearby house opened, and a woman stepped outside, drawn by the flashing police lights. She paused for a moment, then quietly raised her phone and began recording the scene from her porch. Mercer never noticed. He was too focused on finding anything that could justify the stop he had already committed to. But the longer the search continued, the clearer one fact became. There was nothing inside the Lamborghini that supported Mercer's suspicion. And every second that passed was being captured by multiple cameras that would later tell the full story of what had happened on that quiet morning. After nearly 15 minutes of searching, Officer Mercer slammed the rear hatch of the Lamborghini shut with visible frustration. The vehicle had given him nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no illegal items, not even a minor traffic violation he could turn into a citation. The contents of Dr. Carter's purse were still scattered across the hood of the car, catching the sunlight while the red and blue reflections from the patrol lights flickered across the glossy paint. Mercer turned back toward her slowly, crossing his arms as he studied her face again. "Let me ask you something," he said. His voice was calmer now, but the suspicion in it hadn't changed. How exactly does someone like you afford a car like this? Doctor. Carter remained silent, her expression controlled and unreadable. Mercer took a step closer. Did someone buy it for you? He continued. A boyfriend, maybe? He glanced briefly at the Lamborghini, as if the car itself was evidence of something he couldn't yet prove. Or are you involved in something you want to tell me about? Every word was captured clearly by the body camera attached to his uniform. Across the street, the woman standing on her porch continued recording from her phone. The lens pointed steadily at the scene unfolding on the roadside. Dr. Carter finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. Officer, am I being detained? Mercer gave a small, dismissive smirk. You'll leave when I decide you can leave, he replied. The tone in his voice suggested he believed he was completely in control of the situation. There was a brief silence between them. Then Dr. Carter asked a simple question. What is your badge number? Mercer blinked, clearly not expecting that. For a moment he hesitated before answering. Then he recited the number. Doctor. Carter repeated it back slowly to confirm she had heard it correctly. And your last name? She asked. Mercer sighed and spelled it out for her with obvious annoyance. What he didn't realize in that moment was that those small details, the badge number, the name, the time, and the cameras recording everything, were quietly building a record that would soon turn this roadside encounter into something far larger than a routine traffic stop. Nearly 20 minutes after the stop had begun, Officer Mercer finally seemed to realize the search had reached a dead end. There was nothing left to open, nothing left to inspect, and nothing that supported the suspicion he had used to justify pulling the car over in the first place. With visible impatience, he gathered Dr. Carter's license and registration from the hood and handed them back to her without meeting her eyes. There was no citation, no warning, and certainly no apology. The flashing lights from the cruiser still washed across the street as Mercer stepped back toward his patrol car, as if the encounter had already ended in his mind. Dr. Carter quietly collected the belongings that had been emptied from her purse, placing each item back inside before closing it carefully. She then walked around to the driver's door, paused for a moment, and got back into the Lamborghini. The engine started with a soft growl. Without another word, she signaled, checked the road, and pulled away from the curb, driving down Jefferson Parkway at exactly the speed limit. Mercer watched the car disappear into traffic before climbing back into his cruiser. In his incident log later that morning, he would classify the stop as a routine contact with no further action taken. To him, it was just another encounter, another moment of authority that would fade into the hundreds of stops he had conducted over the years. But the moment Dr. Vanessa Carter arrived home, she walked into her study, sat down at her desk, and began writing down everything that had happened. The time of the stop, the badge number, the officer's name, the false claim about marijuana. The search conducted without consent. When she finished the notes, she reached for her phone and began making a series of calls that would soon bring federal investigators into the case. Officer Daniel Mercer had no idea that the routine traffic stop he believed was already forgotten had just triggered the beginning of a federal civil rights investigation that would soon place his entire career under a microscope. Within 48 hours, the first pieces of evidence began arriving at the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Investigators started with the dash camera footage from Officer Mercer's patrol car. The video showed the white Lamborghini moving through traffic exactly as Dr. Carter had described. The lane change Mercer claimed had been suspicious appeared clearly on the recording, and it was perfectly legal. The driver signaled well in advance and merged smoothly into the next lane. There was no violation, no erratic driving, and no reason for a stop. The investigators then moved on to Mercer's body camera footage. From the moment he approached the driver's window, the tone of the encounter was unmistakable. His first question had not been about the supposed traffic violation. Instead, he had immediately demanded to know whose car it was. The footage also captured the moment Mercer claimed he smelled marijuana. Yet as the search unfolded on camera, there was never any discovery of drugs, paraphernalia, or any other evidence supporting that claim. For investigators who had handled civil rights cases before, the pattern looked familiar. A questionable stop followed by a fabricated reason for a search. But the review did not stop there. Analysts began examining Mercer's history of traffic stops over the previous 2 years. The numbers quickly revealed something troubling. Out of nearly 200 recorded stops, the overwhelming majority involved black drivers. Several complaints had already been filed by citizens who claimed they had been searched or questioned without cause, but none of those cases had moved beyond internal review, until now. Because this time the entire encounter had been captured on multiple recordings, and the person behind the wheel had both the legal knowledge and the determination to challenge what had happened. What began as a simple complaint was rapidly turning into a full federal inquiry. 2 weeks after the stop on Jefferson Parkway, federal investigators arrived at the Brookdale Police Department without prior notice. A small team from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division walked through the front doors carrying official subpoenas requesting immediate access to several categories of records. The documents demanded Officer Daniel Mercer's full personnel file, his complaint history, and the body camera footage from every traffic stop he had conducted during the previous 2 years. They also requested department data showing demographic information for all traffic stops performed by Brookdale officers during that same period. When the department leadership read the subpoenas, the seriousness of the situation became immediately clear. What had initially been dismissed as a routine complaint was now the subject of a federal civil rights investigation. Mercer was called back from patrol later that afternoon and asked to report directly to the station. When he arrived, a captain met him in the hallway and instructed him to remove his badge and service weapon. He was informed that he was being placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The news spread quickly through the department. Some officers believed the issue would eventually disappear, like previous complaints had, but others understood that federal investigators rarely stepped in unless the evidence already suggested something serious. Meanwhile, the DOJ team began reviewing internal records, comparing Mercer's stop reports with the video footage and the department's own data. What they were beginning to see was no longer just a single questionable traffic stop. The pattern emerging from the numbers suggested a much larger problem that had gone unchecked for years. And as that pattern became clearer, the focus of the investigation expanded beyond one officer and toward the culture that had allowed those actions to continue without consequence. 3 months after the investigation began, the results were presented to a federal grand jury. The evidence collected by the Department of Justice and the FBI painted a clear and troubling picture. Investigators had reviewed hundreds of hours of body camera footage, traffic stop reports, and internal complaint records. In case after case, they found the same pattern repeated: minor or non-existent traffic violations used as excuses to stop drivers, most of whom were black or Latino. Claims about the smell of marijuana used to justify vehicle searches. Personal belongings removed, inspected, and sometimes confiscated without charges ever being filed. By the time the review was complete, investigators had identified more than a dozen individuals who reported nearly identical encounters with Officer Mercer. Some had been detained for extended periods on the roadside. Others described having their vehicles searched despite repeatedly stating that they did not consent. In several cases, the body camera footage directly contradicted Mercer's written reports. When the federal indictment was finally announced, it contained multiple charges. The most serious accusation was deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal civil rights violation that applies when a law enforcement officer uses official authority to illegally deny someone their constitutional protections. The indictment also included charges related to falsifying official reports and conducting unlawful searches. News of the case spread quickly once the charges were made public. For many residents of Brookdale, the story confirmed suspicions that had existed in the community for years. For Officer Daniel Mercer, however, the announcement marked the beginning of a legal battle that would soon move from investigation to trial in a federal courtroom. The federal trial began 6 months after the indictment in a courtroom inside the United States District Court building downtown. Officer Daniel Mercer sat beside his defense attorney wearing a dark suit instead of the police uniform he had worn for most of his adult life. Across the room, federal prosecutors prepared to present the evidence gathered during the investigation. The government's case focused heavily on the video recordings from the traffic stop involving Dr. Vanessa Carter. When the footage played for the jury, the courtroom fell completely silent. The jurors watched the entire encounter from Mercer's own body camera perspective. They saw the moment he approached the Lamborghini and immediately questioned whether the car belonged to the driver. They heard the claim about smelling marijuana, followed by the search that produced nothing illegal. They listened as Mercer asked how someone like her could afford a vehicle like that. Prosecutors then presented additional recordings from several other traffic stops Mercer had conducted during the previous 2 years. In each video, the pattern looked strikingly similar. Minor reasons for the stop, extended questioning unrelated to traffic enforcement, requests to search vehicles that had not committed any serious violations. Legal experts called by the prosecution explained how the Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. They described how a traffic stop must be based on legitimate suspicion of a violation, not on personal assumptions about who might or might not belong behind the wheel of a particular car. By the time the prosecution finished presenting the video evidence, the jury had seen a detailed picture of how one officer's decisions during routine traffic stops could cross the line from law enforcement into a violation of constitutional rights. After several days of testimony, the prosecution called its final witness to the stand, Dr. Vanessa Carter. When she entered the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. She took her seat calmly, raised her right hand, and was sworn in before beginning her testimony. Speaking in a steady, measured voice, she described the morning of the stop along Jefferson Parkway exactly as it had happened. She explained how she had been driving within the speed limit, how she had signaled properly before changing lanes, and how she had pulled over immediately when the patrol lights appeared behind her. She then described the moment Officer Mercer approached the window and asked whose car it was, and the comment that followed when he questioned how someone like her could afford a vehicle like that. The jury listened closely as she recounted standing beside her car while her purse was emptied across the hood and the entire vehicle searched despite her clear statement that she did not consent. She spoke about the feeling of being treated as a suspect when she had done nothing wrong, and how the experience illustrated exactly the kind of constitutional violations she had spent years studying and teaching about. When the defense attorney attempted to suggest that Mercer had simply been following procedure, Dr. Carter calmly pointed out the inconsistencies between Mercer's written report and the footage recorded by his own body camera. By the time her testimony ended, the jury had heard not only the legal explanation of what had occurred, but also the human experience behind it. After closing arguments from both sides, the case was handed to the jury for deliberation. The decision they were about to make would determine whether Officer Daniel Mercer's actions on that quiet Saturday morning were simply a mistake or a federal crime. The jury deliberated for just under 7 hours. When they finally returned to the courtroom the following afternoon, the tension in the room was unmistakable. Officer Daniel Mercer sat motionless at the defense table, staring straight ahead as the foreperson stood and handed the verdict form to the court clerk. One by one, the charges were read aloud. Guilty on deprivation of rights under color of law. Guilty on conducting an unlawful search. Guilty on falsifying official reports. The words echoed through the courtroom, each one marking the end of a career Mercer had spent 15 years building. At the sentencing hearing several weeks later, the judge addressed him directly. She explained that the authority given to police officers exists to protect the constitutional rights of citizens, not to ignore them. By stopping a driver without legal cause, fabricating a reason to search the vehicle, and questioning her based on assumptions rather than evidence, Mercer had used that authority in a way the law could not tolerate. The sentence was 5 years in federal prison, along with the permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification. The Brookdale Police Department was later placed under federal oversight, requiring new training programs, independent review of traffic stop data, and stricter accountability for officer conduct. As for Dr. Vanessa Carter, she returned to her classroom at Georgetown University. Months later, during a lecture about the Fourth Amendment, one of her students asked whether the law truly protected everyone equally. Dr. Carter paused before answering. "The Constitution gives us those protections," she said. But it only works when people are willing to defend them. What had started as a routine traffic stop on a quiet Saturday morning had ended with a federal conviction, a department under reform, and a reminder that the law applies to everyone, including those sworn to enforce it.